this is Aprille Walker from the Yoga Ranger Studio. When I first started practicing yoga, some poses I found to be particularly difficult or challenging, given I just hadn't done those kind of positions or range of motion. I had a lot of tightness in a lot of different areas. And one of those poses that particularly challenged me as a beginner, and honestly through most of my practice up till now, has been downward facing dog. So if you are someone who has struggled with this pose, this tutorial might give you some ideas on how to find more comfort in that pose. So downward facing dog you'll see in a lot of different classes, most often in sun salutations, but everybody uses it. And the reason they do is because it stretches the side body, the chest and shoulders, the back side of the heart, the legs, hamstrings, calves, a little bit of the quads, the back of the ankles. It's a full body stretch. So when you do find your comfort in this pose, or at least some sense of comfort, it's a great pose to just practice to stretch everything out all at once. So we're going to start with a couple of ideas here. So a lot of people, when they place their hands down on the floor, have been taught either to align their first pointer finger with the edge of the mat. I don't find that particularly comfortable for me. So what I've done is I've taken it where the edge of my mat is in alignment with the center space in between my first and second fingers. So you can either rotate in a little bit or out a little bit to find what's most comfortable for you and that your shoulders feel most comfortable. And the best way to start with that is to come onto hands and knees. So you spread your fingers wide, take your hands underneath your shoulders, and you can turn them out a little bit and see if that feels better, or turn them in a little bit and see if that feels better. Find your space here. You're going to press most of your weight into the base of the thumb, base of the first finger. And you're going to, instead of having you look down at your elbows and see if they're pointing toward one another, you want to rotate them forwards without changing the position of your hands. So that engages the biceps and triceps, turning them forward, and it locks your shoulders into a better, more comfortable, stable position. So alternatives for downward facing dog are keeping your hips where they're at and walking your hands out and taking puppy pose, which is a great stretch in and of itself, or taking child's pose, knees together or wide apart, either one. Another alternative for these is to take your hands wider, turn them out a little bit more, flip your toes, come back into downward facing dog. Now I like this one because taking my hands a little bit wider feels like a really good stretch. Walk them closer together. And I would say practice both ways. It's good for you, right? So we're going to come into plank to get your measurements. So most people have no idea that often they're taking downward facing dog in a very short stance, and this makes it much harder for you to hold it for longer, especially for your hamstrings. So by coming into plank, you find out exactly how far your feet are supposed to be away from you. When you shift back into downward facing dog, this is your downward facing dog, right? If your feet were closer to you and you tried to come into plank, you would not be able to. So it's always best to start from plank, find your position, rock back into downward facing dog. So a couple of modifications here. You can bend your knees a little bit or a lot. I like to take my knees really bent, shift back, stretch my shoulders, and then start to straighten them out, maybe keeping them a little bent or all the way straight. Don't worry about taking your heels down to the floor. That is not a goal. Some people can, some people can't. It has a lot to do with bone structure, not as much to do with how limber you are or how flexible. You can come up on your toes, stretch, and then start to press those heels down. You can walk your dog out, find a little movement. Sometimes it's hard to hold a static position, or rock your hips a little bit side to side to stretch the side body. You can take your stance a little bit wider. So normally we say about hip distance apart, but if you wanted to go wider and stretch the upper back a little bit more, give yourself more space, that works too. I practice all different ways. So for your feet, you want to take them about hip distance apart. So your second toe is about right down the middle of your knee and all the way up to the middle of your hip. Shift back, stretch your shoulders. Now if you wanted to take your feet further back, you could stretch more of your shoulders,
If you wanted to take your feet further forward, you could stretch your hamstrings and calves a little bit more.
The thing I suggest most if you are a beginner or new to yoga and your downward facing dog is giving you some struggle is to always warm your wrists up before you start practicing. So before you start the class, while you're sitting there waiting for a couple of minutes or on your drive there, you can take one hand and just circle the wrists just to get the fluid moving in there, loosen the area up. Maybe you take a couple of little stretches like fingers pointed toward one another, rock side to side, turn them out, rock side to side, turn them in, rock side to side. Find a little stretch and get that mobility in there. For when I started doing that, that really helped me hold my downward facing dog. But there's also alternatives. So if in a downward facing dog, you're in a normal class where they hold generally downward facing dog for about 5 breaths, you can take child's pose or puppy pose for 2 to 3 of those breaths and then shift back into downward facing dog for the last 1 to 2 breaths of the practice. Over time, you'll begin transitioning where you're taking 3 breaths in downward facing dog, 2 in the others, or 4 breaths in downward facing dog, 1 in the others. So transition out of whatever pose you're in, and they say come into downward facing dog, you can transition and hold child's pose or puppy pose for a couple of breaths, and then into downward facing dog. This is going to allow your body to sort of learn and grow and develop the musculature and the openness to hold this pose longer and feel more comfortable with it. As always, if you feel any shooting pains or really strong discomfort in the pose, you should come down and take the alternatives until you feel a little bit more comfortable with it. And it's always good to sort of check in and see how you're feeling. Over time, you will build the strength to hold this pose, I promise you, because I did, and I could never hold it at the beginning, and I thought when she held it for 5 breaths that I was never going to make it. So you too can do this. I hope that you enjoyed this practice. If you did, please don't forget to like and comment below, and please don't forget to subscribe. I am going to begin uploading some of these tutorials on some of the poses that I have struggled with over my years of practice, and there have definitely been many of them that have challenged me, just in an attempt to offer you some options and alternatives to test out and try in your practice to see if you can find more comfort in your practice using a little bit of my past experience. So thank you so much for checking out this tutorial, and I hope that helped. Have a great day.